Thank you very much, Eric, and hello to all. Thank you for joining this first session in our Shifting Policy and Practice series. It warms my heart to see the faces of so many friends and colleagues today, transcending all kinds of distance to come together as a field. As you all know, in ordinary years, we have gathered in person at assemblies to learn, to see our peers, and to celebrate together. Unfortunately, that's not possible right now. We're especially sad that we won't be joining our former hosts, the Institute of Puerto Rican Culture in San Juan at this time. But we can all bring the spirit of San Juan to wherever we are today by using some nifty Zoom backgrounds from Discover Puerto Rico. So I myself am enjoying this backdrop of old San Juan, but there are others from which you can choose, and Eric will share that link in the chat. Like many of you, NASA is fully embracing the digital learning power to engage more people. Going online is making our content accessible to everyone, regardless of your ability to travel. We're also making today's sessions more inclusive by providing captions, not just in English, but in Spanish translation as well. Eric will be circulating another link in the chat with more information about how to access those. From now through October, NASA has a menu of provocative sessions that's focused on state arts agencies and the new realities that the arts are facing. This year has challenged us over and over again, from the public health crisis to the economic upheaval of COVID-19 to the societal reckonings that have exposed the cracks in American justice and government institutions. We've all been affected personally and professionally too. NASA knows, though, that state arts agencies are going to rise to meet this moment by supporting each other and finding new ways to serve communities. And this learning series from now through October is designed to help you. We're going to tackle some tough issues: financial crises, funding equity, political polarization, just to name a few. But even as we call those tough questions, we'll share abundant bright spots. We'll offer rays of hope. We'll give you practical actions that you can take to move your agency forward. Our first two pivot sessions, today and tomorrow, are great examples. We've enlisted an all-star cast to help us reflect on what the arts landscape looks like now, where it might head next, and how grant makers can make a difference for the field's evolution. This will be followed tomorrow by a part 2 pivot session that drills more deeply into state arts agency adaptations. To kick things off for us today, we have Omari Rush, Executive Director of CultureSource in Michigan. Omari is the first Vice Chair of the NASA Board of Directors, and he'll be leading the conversation. Joining him are Maurine Knighton from the Doris Charitable Foundation, Diane John Mary from LaPlaca Cohen, and Jamie Bennett from ArtPlace America. This phenomenal brain trust of good friends will spend the first part of the session exploring today's theme, but all of you online will have a chance to weigh in, to make comments, to ask questions along the way. Drop a chat line to Eric Giles. The question mark that he mentioned in front of his Zoom name does not indicate an identity crisis, but rather his receptivity to your observations and your questions throughout the session. So just drop him a line anytime. And with that, I'm going to get out of the way and turn things over to Omari.
Thank you, Kelly and Eric, for those introductions. And it's, again, really great to be joined by Maurine, Jamie, and Diane on this this video call today. I appreciate you all's time as your panelists and everybody in the room's time as just like curious folks who want to learn and share and connect. So thank you for being with us. I'll say, in addition to what Kelly shared, I bring to this conversation my identity as the chair of the State of Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. And because we're in a state arts agency context, I just wanted to give a shout out to what they're doing at MCACA in Michigan. I'm just so proud of that state agency and its leader, Allison Watson, and the whole team for what they've been doing to, help all of us in Michigan in the arts and culture sector navigate some pretty tricky times in a pretty tricky landscape. And so thinking about that landscape in the session, Diane, Jamie, Maurine, I'm going to actually ask you if we could just kind of popcorn around, just kind of rapid fire, just to get us on the same page about what this landscape is, like what things are actually characterizing the landscape right now. And we'll just go rapid fire, Diane, Jamie, Maurine, Diane, Jamie, Maurine, just something that, an observation, something that you notice, what's defining it. If I were to go first, I would say boycotts, I think particularly new. But how about we give it a go? Diane, Jamie, Maurine.
I love this. I love the hot potato style of questioning. I'll go first and I won't state the most obvious one. What's facing the sector right now that I'm noticing is a lot of invention.
Great, Jamie?
And maybe I'll just add reflection to the mix.
And I'll add to the mix uncertainty.
Great. We're going to go around a couple times, folks, so there's plenty to say. And even think about just I'll add mine. I'll say political partisanship via the election.
Mm-hmm. I think every org is having to be a health and culture brand in this moment. So an attention to the health and safety of their audiences.
Jamie.
And just in terms of the health and safety of themselves, the sort of exhaustion and self-care.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then I would certainly be remiss if I didn't observe the societal reckoning with which we're all dealing.
Mm-hmm. Historians and relics of the past to bring us closer to an understanding of where we are in the context of that reckoning.
Yeah. And I'm actually calling in, I'm temporarily in Canada. And so I found myself thinking a lot about the truth and reconciliation frame that the First Nations of Canada have been engaged with for a while. And maybe this is a moment that America is going to pick that up as well.
And segueing from there, Jamie, I think that we are at a point of no return. That's really going to, depending on which way we turn, is going to define really the future of this country and the character of it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We'll go one more round.
Okay. Rethinking what culture is, what it means, who the holders of those culture, that beacons of culture ultimately should and could be, and considering how best to co-create, to broaden access, to truly transform within the organization, but also in the larger societal context.
And maybe a colleague got me thinking recently about strong ties and weak ties, a sociological notion. Strong ties are family or church or coworkers. Weak ties, the person I see every morning buying coffee, even though I don't know her name. And in this moment of physical distancing, many of us have lost most or all of our weak ties. And so I've been thinking a lot about that.
And on the flip side of the coin, it is a moment where we really appreciate differently the power and importance and value of connection. And even those weak ties have the capacity and potential to become something greater, including having greater import and prominence in our lives.
Great. Thanks for thanks for being willing to hold the hot potato, to use Diane's metaphor. At the beginning of this call, and folks on the call, I'll actually now invite you all to participate a little bit, but slightly more maybe metaphorical or creatively. Your words are very creative, panel. That was great. And I also just want to get you all warmed up in using the chat. It would be wonderful for you all to think about the landscape and what you're experiencing in your daily life, what it all means to you, and to, in 3 words, express that landscape or define that landscape, and share it with everybody in the chat. It can be abstract, it can be literal, you can use emojis, those are allowed. But it'd just be great to see how people are responding and feeling about the landscape and what it means to them. Again, literally, abstractly, in image, you name it, you got it. Thank you for participating. Maurine, I'll start with you in asking, you know, to reflect on that landscape and how, you know, our arts and culture sector is experiencing it. You know, things have been tough before. Does this feel like a familiar kind of toughness? Does it feel new? What are you thinking about it?
Yeah, thanks, Omari. And let me first, you know, I'm from the South, so my mother would kill me if I didn't say hello and good afternoon to everyone. So let me just take care of that before I move on. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. You know, this is a moment, Omari, in answer to your question, that is both the same and different than what we've encountered before. You know, when this first began, and especially in New York City, where I work, and the shutdown took effect, folks really began to think about it, especially my colleagues in arts philanthropy on the private side, began to think about, well, what are proxies that can help us figure out a way forward? And so folks spent a lot of time thinking about 9/11, and they spent time thinking about how the landscape was altered in the face of and the aftermath of 9/11. And then they thought, oh, well, maybe it's the recession of 2008, 2009. And while there are shadows of each of those events that are directly affecting the arts and culture landscape, this is also different in that I think we will likely emerge perhaps not completely unrecognizable, but significantly transformed. I think that with the prior 2 events that I mentioned, the general idea was, well, how do we get through this period so we can return to business as usual? And while there are still folks in the field who are thinking that way, I think it's less likely to in reality. I think the truth is we've never met this time before. And so we are trying to figure out step by step the way forward. Folks in private philanthropy, for example, understand that you cannot ask for the same types of information that reflect out as far or project out as far, especially budgets, for example, from grantees, and expect them to give you really robust information because no one understands what's going on. And so it calls on us to do things like say, okay, I'll take your projections for the next quarter or the next 6 months, realizing that that's about as far as anyone can responsibly share. So that's just one example, but I'll stop there. So the bottom line, Omari, is that this is a very, very different landscape, although there are some parts of the terrain that may look somewhat familiar.
Great, thanks, Maurine. Diane, what would you say?
Yeah, so much rang true in what you just shared, Maureen. And I think the things that feel familiar to us in this time that are true of both of those events that you mentioned, 9/11 and the 2008-2009 recession, are the uncertainty and the great need for healing. Those are still incredibly true of this moment we found ourselves in today. But there are also some things that feel novel to this time. And I would agree wholeheartedly that the notion of transformation feels permanent in this moment. It feels like it's not up for question. We must transform if we're going to move forward in any way that moves us forward as an institution, as a society, as a public. But one thing that we're seeing in our work, and worth saying that at LaPlaca Cohen, we are advisors to the field. So we have a fairly high level 300,000 foot view of what's happening in the sector across many disciplines. We also field research related to the field of culture, but told through the hearts and minds of the audiences themselves. And when we started Culture Track in 2001 in the wake of 9/11, we felt this great need for togetherness, connection. One of the hard parts of where we find ourselves today as a field is that we actually cannot come together to physically connect. And so that requires a level of creativity and invention that we haven't seen before. So that it's not just another Zoom call, just another meeting, to create moments for us to have novelty again in our lives, to have adventure and wonder again in our lives, and to ultimately look back at the role of the arts, the most essential role of the arts, in distilling our human experience, helping us process uncertainty, process who we are as humans to each other, and help us bridge that divide to a greater, more connected, more just society. I think that's where we're really seeing our landscape move toward. And those who are, planning for return back to normal, I think they'll be looking at the other end of this, wishing that they would have chosen a different path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. The distancing is tricky. Jamie, thinking about terrain and space, and places, ArtPlace, and you thinking about difficulties. What are you sensing? What are you feeling across a variety of places? How does difficulty intersect with place in this moment?
Yeah, and so maybe what I'll add is my experience, and as I've been talking with colleagues around the country, many of them have shared that this moment isn't so much creating new problems as it is putting a magnifying glass on problems that long existed. So something that was a problem yesterday is still a problem today, but 100-fold, 1,000-fold. And I think about sort of the wealthy arts organizations that have endowments, have their wealth invested in the stock market, were fine before the pandemic, are fine during the pandemic, will be fine again after it. I think a lot about sort of the way the criminal justice system works, and to sort of quote Brian Stevenson, we have long in this country had a criminal justice system that treats you better if you are rich, white, and guilty than if you are poor, black, and innocent. I think a lot about rural America and how it's been cut off and disconnected from broadband access and from a lot of the other infrastructure that's in place for the more urbanized parts of the country. And I think a lot about sort of older Americans who often struggle with social isolation and in ways that are just being sort of compounded and magnified. So what I'm hoping is that this moment might bring a new urgency to the problems that folks have been working on for 40, 50, 60, 70 years. And that, as Maurine said, this might be a point where we say, now's the moment to fix these things that we've been all too comfortable putting up with for far too long.
So for all three of you, whoever wants to jump in, Jamie, that last bit that you said, this might be a moment to actually fix those things. What does might mean, Like, do you think it will be? Are you hopeful that it is going to be? Do you see regression already happening? Do you see tons of progress already happening?
I think that insofar as it's costly to the organization to not pursue change, they're going to put it off for as long as possible. But we're not in that moment anymore. We have the entire nation from so many different angles, people voting with their dollars as consumers, people on the streets protesting, brands and organizations being boycotted. We have this outcry for change. And as long as the public continues to hold our field accountable, and as long as staff, board, leaders within organizations continue to hunt for their place in this change, I think it's necessary for us all to fight where we are and to pursue justice where we are and to find our place in the movement that we seek to change. So the might, I feel pretty confident that this is a time unlike any other, and that every single individual, every single organization, every single country is looking itself in the mirror and realizing that we have some sins to atone for, And we have a lot of change that is on the road ahead. And if we do not, we will become irrelevant. And that is where it becomes costly. So to maintain your relevance in our society, to maintain your relevance in the lives of people, we have to be in conversation with all of this, and not just dialogue, but actually backing that with action, with change, with sustained long-term commitment to seeing transformation that lasts not just to tomorrow, not to next quarter, but to generations ahead.
I would love to pick up on that, Diane, because what you said is spot on. But I also want to second Jamie's point about the idea of might. I think that what we are seeing now is people figuring out their role and their responsibility. That's happening on an individual basis, it's happening within our organizations, and of course, it's reflecting out to the country at large. But there are many choice points, and everyone matters. And many of us feel either ill-equipped or afraid and or uncomfortable to do the things that could leave us on the right side of the ledger here. And so I do think that what we're seeing and have seen in recent months, both around the pandemic, as well as around the economic crisis, and let's not forget, of course, the demands for social justice, is we're seeing so far a lot of performative engagement. And, you know, that's fine. That's a great place to start, but it has to be understood as a starting point, not an end point, but an opening really is what it represents. What happens next, and for how long, and how deeply committed are you to what happens next, and what are you willing to do to bring it about? And so might is really exactly the right word to use.
And maybe I'll just pick up and say, I think this is a moment in which every organization in the US is leading with its values. And I'll use two examples from New York City where I'm normally domiciled. One is an organization that has a $2 billion endowment that responded to this moment by laying off its education staff. And the second is an organization, Theater of the Oppressed New York City, which was just recently profiled in Inside Philanthropy, an organization with less than $1 million in an annual budget. And they launched a $50,000 relief fund to buy technology upgrades and provide cash subsidies for their staff. So I think this is a moment where people are doubling down and leading with their values. And I don't know if it's true for others, but we seem to have stunned Omari into dropping off the call. So Diane, I wonder if you have an additional thought.
Happy to hop in. I think you're absolutely right, Jamie, that this moment, and you said it up top, right? This is a great revealer, this moment of who you are, what you stand for. Organizations are showing us where their values stand. But when we think about these audiences, to ultimately who we serve, the audiences of communities, they're also showing us where they stand and what they value. And they're looking for culture and the arts more broadly to provide for them a sense of escape, a sense of understanding, a sense of that drop shoulder moment where you're like, yes, we can breathe again. We're all just clenching our fists and holding our breath, it seems, for the last couple of months. And I do think that the arts, instead of stepping to the back, to the fore, and waiting and listening for others to really tell them what to do, that there's a real gap, there's a real moment in our landscape to step into the light and say, you know, we don't have this all figured out, we're not going to do it perfectly, but we will figure it out along the way, we will broadcast what we're learning, we will collaborate with others, and we'll try to just march our way through this moment of uncertainty in order to help our staff, help our communities with their families, with their livelihoods, and ultimately with their connection to the arts more broadly.
I would tag on once again, Diane, to say that you know, we have, again, my earlier answer was that we've seen this time before and we've never seen a time like it, basically. And I think the same is true with regard to everyday folks' connection to the arts. I think that, you know, we often find ourselves at a place as folks who are cultural workers where we say the arts really matter, the arts increase quality of life, the arts deliver these co-benefits economically. You know, we have lots of different ways to enter into a defense and explication of the power of the arts. And sometimes we're more successful and sometimes it sticks, sometimes it doesn't. It's been insufficient up to this point, even to the degree that there has been stickiness. And so I think right now, back to this notion that Jamie mentioned much earlier in the conversation around weak connections or relationships or thin engagement, as some other folks would say, and strong connections or engagement as well. And so I think that here is a time, unlike others, where folks can really see that showing up different in a more powerful and legible way, I think, than perhaps at points in our past.
Yeah, everyone will remember if you helped them educate their children, you know, while they had to hold down a full-time job simultaneously while homeschooling multiple kids. People will remember if you were the place where activists came and made their posters before a Black Lives Matters march, and you allowed protesters to come in and use your facilities to clean up and relieve themselves. People remember that. Right. And I'm seeing that. I'm based in Brooklyn. I'm seeing a lot of that energy from the cultural institutions in my own neighborhood. But one thing that's been so invigorating for me in this time is that kind of tossing away of the elite snobbery that tends to follow the institution of culture. Yes. And loosening up the suit and tie and saying, we are now with you, we are human, we are figuring things out too, and we want to help to make your lives easier. We want to help to make you more informed. We want to learn alongside you. And I think it's only when you can say that culture is truly for everyone and that there isn't the elitist barrier of it just being for the upper echelons of society to enjoy their own forms of art that they deem important. As soon as we shake all of that, you can become much more embedded authentically within community.
Right. Yeah.
So
Omari,
this is Omar. I'm still here. My video may be coming in just a tad bit slow and in and out, but I'm connected via phone. So that connection is stable. Diane, in part picking up on what you just shared, I guess I wonder what other kinds of concrete kind of changes you all expect this moment to bring about, like very direct practices that must, you know, if we change might to must, which that's a book title somewhere, Might to Must. But if we change, if we think about what must change and kind of very specifically things that we should stop or start, are there other things that that come to mind?
I think the very initial premise that culture is a white-centered space will be forever altered by this moment. So I think historically it's been very white-centered, designed for white audiences, showing white art. And every now and then within a year, within a program, exhibition, education program, you'll get a little dash of color. And those days are long behind us. Partially because I think in this country, we're realizing that American history involves all of us, and that for us to truly understand where we are today, we have to reckon with where we've been as a past. It's not just Black history. Like, right there was an actor that participated, a very active actor that participated in the history, and in creating the situations and the systems, infrastructure, the sociocultural dynamics that we are now in a moment of exposure for. And all of that is coming to light even in the art that hangs on the wall and in the performances that get to share the stage. So in that way, I think that's a must. I think we can no longer silo people of color to smaller stages and to smaller slots. We have to now thoroughly engage in a shared space of culture and see what magic can happen when you truly do welcome people of all backgrounds.
Hey, what's your sense about a practice that must change?
Omari, I wasn't sure who you were calling on. I apologize, I couldn't hear that part.
Oh, Jamie.
Oh, I was hoping it was Maurine. Apologies. I think building on a piece of what Diane was saying, one of the things that my experience has been that oftentimes when groups like this gather, we say we're going to have a conversation about arts and culture. And then we end up having a conversation about the piece of arts and culture that's intermediated by nonprofit organizations. And I think in this moment, there's been a really dramatic reminder to the nonprofit arts and culture sector that America's consumption of arts and culture is much broader than just that which we mediate, right? And so, you know, we've got to think about Beyonce, we've got to think about John Grisham, we've got to think about Sofia Vergara, we've got to think about the kinds of things that are available in the marketplace. And we've got to think about the kinds of folk and traditional and heritage, the sort of informal art. And so one of the things I've seen in a really beautiful way is nonprofit arts and cultural organizations welcoming in the informal arts and the commercial arts so that we really can begin operating and curating as a continuum, and to that notion that Diane was saying, actually present a better mirror of who we are as Americans and what our stories are.
Solid, yeah. I will just, I'll say that that is certainly an energy that we're excited about in Detroit and Michigan, is this idea of you know, using this moment to invite others in, or to think about who's in, who's out, who's choosing to be out, who's choosing to be in. Just be very introspective about all of that and then to act on it. Maurine, if we take this to the space of being a grant maker, professional philanthropist, what's your sense about how that landscape is responding to these changes in the arts and culture field, and what opportunities might be?
Well, I think that we are learning with the field about what matters and how to identify choice points. So for sure, we don't want to get ahead of where the field is, but I do think there's some important ways where we can provide important signals. For example, one of the things Jamie just alluded to is the notion of opening our apertures with regard to what matters, what is important, what is worth supporting. And so I think that private philanthropy can, through the grants that it makes, recognize informally organized groups that are not 501c3s, which, by the way, won't be serving us well. It's already stopped serving us well as the only or main mechanism through which arts and culture is supported. So I think looking at the different ways groups are organized and being sure that we are accommodating that, rather than really clinging old ways of doing things that no longer serve us. I already talked about flexibility. I gave the example of budget projections, but I think that's also something that we need to attend to more generally. I will jump on the bandwagon that everyone else is already on of providing general operating support in cases where that is at all possible. And if it is not possible, to be as flexible with grantees as possible so that they are not, in fact, subsidizing the work that we're funding them to do. I think also we have an important role to play with signaling who is doing the work that will help build communities. So if we're faced with a situation, as I often am, where I am asked by an organization of color for support for a piece of work, and then I might be approached by a predominantly white organization that is asking for funding that is fundamentally the same in terms of the programmatic core of it. I have to, but except with one of the important exceptions is typically that's a much higher dollar ask than for the organization of color. I should not automatically default to supporting the predominantly white institution for doing work that the organization of color has been doing since its founding, and in fact, that is embedded in its DNA. I think also it's important to help organizations remember that all of this work exists because of the artists themselves. So we have the obligation, in fact, to keep organizations honest and keep ourselves honest about having what we do be artist-centered and artist-centric as well. Finally, to understand that we are partners to our grantees. I often say to my grantees, if you don't win, we don't win. Because the reason we're giving them funding is because we think they can accomplish something that helps further our strategies and our mission, in fact. And so we have to be available to them to help them think through issues. We have to be willing to advocate for them, to make introductions, so to network on their behalf, to help them think about other resources. And so I think that the opportunity for us in private philanthropy is to show up more fully, more authentic, and with great intention to make a positive, lasting impact.
Maurine, can I ask you a follow-up just to that?
Please.
So in the example that you gave, I think it's such a brilliant one. Would you ever in that case kind of join the two organizations in a collaborative network if they have shared aims and they have very different organizational capacity and endowment sizes?
That's a great question. I wouldn't go so far as to suggest it, because the thing that we know in the philanthropy world is when you ask a question, sometimes it can land as a demand or a directive. And so I always try to be very careful and respectful of that. However, I would want to know whether each of the organization is aware of the work that the other is doing. But it would have to be organic. If they then, becoming aware of each of the other's work, decided we want to partner, then we would be interested in seriously considering that, with the important caveat, Diane. Often what we see in those sorts of partnerships is we see the larger budget institution, which tends to be a predominantly white institution, as the applicant. The money flows through them. And then there's a portion that is allocated to the organization of color. We try to do the opposite, so that it is the organization of color that in fact has the intellectual assets, the intellectual property, the networks, the relationships, all of that, that the larger budget institution is hopeful to gain access to. Then they are the ones who should manage the financial life of the project as well. So I look at those power dynamics often and seek out opportunities to shift them, because that's an important invitation to everyone involved to understand and appreciate differently what each partner brings to the table.
Maurine, thanks for between your original answer and Diane's follow-up. Thanks for modeling just some super solid thoughtfulness related to the process. And as we just dig into this a little bit more, I'd kind of like to pick up on something that Jamie just put into the chat and talk about language a little bit. And I guess, I'll open this up to any of you, how you're thinking about language and how we might be able to shift, use different words, understand when something is charged. What comes to mind? Specifically, there's a question about, well, what does informal mean? And what is it relative to? Thinking about, many of the people on this call end up being communicators, whether in guidelines or whether as a partner to someone in the field. How are you all thinking about languages as part of your professional work?
Well,
Jamie, feel free to.
I can start from the Bennett
Diane, go for it.
Of Culture Track.
Yeah.
Just because we actually believe that we as a field can't define what culture is. That is our starting assumption. We as the institutions cannot define it. So we ask the people to instead. So each iteration of Culture Track, we have the audience tell us what they think culture actually is, who it's for, what it does, what its value ultimately is for us in our society. And each year the list gets broader and broader and broader. And so in this last iteration, it wasn't just the museological field and parks and zoos and aquaria. They're talking about gaming. They're talking about playing sports together. They're speaking about what happens when you cook with your mom in the kitchen. And when you share recipes with your cousin who might live in another country, that's all culture. Doing arts and crafts with your knitting group. So all of that landed into our last iteration of the study, which we just fielded actually at the outbreak of the pandemic. It went live in July, and we fielded the study in March and April of this year. And it was fascinating to see just how with every iteration of our study, the audience's notion of what culture ultimately is has continued to grow. And the connective tissue between all of those activities essentially is that it helps us understand the world and it brings us together in a way that's meaningful to us, that enhances our lives. So when we're thinking about the collaborative landscape, in what Maurine was saying, just like the landscape of partners acknowledging who has participated in that sphere that you're trying to get access to, whether it's to broaden and diversify your audience, or to tap into some level of intellectual property or some level of cultural cachet that another organization offers, you do have to pay attention to the dynamic of power and the dynamic of what's already in existence, to acknowledge there are people who have been steeped in this work for decades. Let's not create it anew. We are not on page zero. We can go and partner in a way that builds all of our capacity, builds all of our impacts, helps us all serve our missions. So I think directionally the field is really headed that way. And directionally, the audiences are also asking us to think adventurously and to think widely about who we consider our peers in the field. Because if you are a museum, your peer just might be Netflix, and that could present a really interesting partnership in the future.
So, Diane, thanks for that. Jamie, I'll go to you next and ask this for you to kind of muse on language, but I'll actually ask the room if you might re-embrace the chat function. And it'd be great if everybody could just put a word in the chat that you're thinking a lot about. How to use it, whether you want to use it, is it appropriate to use, you don't know the definition of it, what is culture, what is informal. It'd just be curious to see, language is cheap and free to change and free to play with, and so it'd be curious to see what words are really coming to mind for the room. Jamie, thoughts about how the role that language plays in either grant making or the change that we're looking to see in our field.
Yeah, I'll maybe start by sharing with, there's a colleague called Susan Nelson at TDC who many folks know. And I was lucky enough to be listening and learning from her last week. And she noted that oftentimes in the nonprofit sector and oftentimes in philanthropy, we talk about best practices. And she observed that maybe we don't have any best practices, we just have common practices, right? And so that notion of common practices becoming solidified as best practices because of the language we use is that example that Maurine was digging into, right? It has long been a common practice in philanthropy to invest more dollars in a white organization that's thinking about diversifying its audience than investing in a different kind of organization that's generating content and has been since its founding. And Maurine and I can't remember how long ago it was, Maurine, you and I were on a panel for Sphinx in Detroit. And we talked, for instance, about the way beginning in the late 80s and more in the 90s, philanthropy began engaging with multiculturalism, began engaging with audience diversity. And all of the attention was about changing the color of the faces in the audience at the symphony orchestra. And we thought that that was a problem, that too many white people were going to the symphony orchestra. But no one thought it was a problem that, 90+% of the audience for taiko drumming were individuals of Japanese heritage, right? And so because of the language we use, I think we've forgotten that symphony orchestras are actually culturally specific, right? They are one of the art forms, one of the cultural traditions that those of us who are part of the European diaspora in North America brought with us. But we don't often use the term diaspora to talk about the European diaspora in North America. And so we end up investing in white arts and culture as the dominant culture. And it's really important for everyone to engage in it. And I think far too often we invest in other culturally specific art forms in a way that treats them more like they're electives rather than the core of what we're doing. And I think a lot of that gets codified in language, and language can sort of become an echo chamber where one idea begins bouncing back and forth and gains currency and becomes codified as a best practice.
So either Jamie as a follow-up or Maurine as a follow-up to your earlier response about the things that you're thinking about in grant making, what is your process of unpacking a practice, remixing a practice, something that's been the way it is for a while or spoken the way it is for a while? How do you all find that you know where to start with changing things up?
Well, I mean, you start by asking the people that you intend to benefit what they need. And then you have to be genuinely interested in the answer and willing to make adjustments in response to what they've told you. You also have to be humble enough to realize that you may not have all of the best ideas about how to resolve a challenge by yourself, and that in fact partnership may be the best way forward. I think in addition to that, you may need some help just looking at your current practices, because when we're steeped in practices and we've been doing them for so long, they become ingrained, embedded. And so we don't necessarily even have an objective eye toward recognizing things that in fact may be problematic. So I think, for me, I'm always doing what I call kitchen table conversations with folks from the field to say, hey, what's going on? What do you see that we're doing? In fact, I just did that week before last. I had 2 different days of those conversations with folks from the field, because I think that it is presumptuous and probably counterproductive for us to begin by thinking that we know what to do. We don't often. And so I think we start by humbling ourselves and asking questions. And I think the last thing that I would say about that, Omari, is that it would be important not to gather as much information as you can, do as much as you can, but to not decide that you are paralyzed by not having all the answers and or not having sufficient authority. I think that that's a reality for all of us. We typically all work within some sort of authorizing environment, and where we may or may not be the person ultimately with whom final decisions rest, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. What is it that is within your purview that you can do that could make a material difference? How can you advocate for and socialize other ideas and bring others with you? And so I think that there are a number of places to start. And the main thing though is to start casting that critical eye at the work that you feel very comfortable with and that you've been doing and probably getting some positive feedback for over the years, but with the clarity that that may not be good right now, even though it was fabulous a year ago.
Mm-hmm. Diane, thinking about this kitchen table, these kitchen table conversations, what I know of you and your work, you're often in a position of putting together kitchen table conversations and being at them. And so I guess, I wonder, when you're thinking about an organization, a client, a kind of an activity in our sector, how do you think about structuring those conversations? Who do you find that you get a lot of value from having at that table?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right, Omari, to say that we often as a firm find ourselves in the critical moment where an organization has enough self-awareness to know that it doesn't have it all figured out. So there are plenty who have not reached that point and never pick up the phone to call us. But for the ones that do, we find that the ones that succeed the most have a level of openness to change, have an openness to critically reassessing what they do and why. And honestly, when you're doing the work day in and day out, as Maurine said, it's hard to have a clear, objective lens on what's shifted around you, what's shifted inside your organization. And so we tend to be group therapists or organizational therapists, helping these clients of ours who are across the entire cultural sector really understand their purpose, what they do, who they serve, what they stand for, and clarifying that in a very clear, internally driven way. Now, how we get the best information, it's never when we're sitting with just the leaders of an organization. That's where we get a lot of their ambition and the vision that they ultimately want to steer the organization towards. But it's when we get closest to those who have lived that organization day in and day out alongside visitors that we get the most meaningful insights about what's at the core, the gut of an organization. So it's frontline staff, it's how you treat your volunteers and your guards in your organization, it's who is meeting with the parents and their students in an institution of higher education, who's making sure that faculty are taken care of in that context. So we tend to look high and low at every level of an organization, interviewing their board, interviewing their leadership, and spending a lot of time with staff and with volunteers, because that's ultimately at the heart of the org. That's where their values are expressed. You find out really quickly how staff are treated, how they're valued, and how they ultimately get to be decision makers in their roles. They get to have agency in their roles. And to be able to tap into those choice points that we spoke about earlier on in the conversation, to empower someone at every single level of the org is rare, but it's ultimately what we think is required of an organization if it's going to be nimble and be responsive and to be able to flex to certainly this context of uncertainty. So it's only when you look at every angle of the org that you're able to get some of that essential nature, the special secret sauce of what an organization truly is.
Mm-hmm. Jamie, I'm thinking about what, where Diane just kind of ended in talking about thinking of people at all different levels of the organization and a certain kind of empowerment and a voice. And then I think about what Maurine talked about in terms of, working with authorizing, within an environment of authorization or authorizing agents. And I guess I wonder how you think about making change in our sector, in our field, when it's within the context of having some kind of authorizing agent that you have to work through or with. How do you think about being direct or indirect, short term, long term? It's like, maybe just talk a little bit about that. And it's particularly curious for you because of the structure of ArtPlace too.
Yeah, and so I'll, just as a little bit of context, I'll say that I'm currently working in a single member LLC organization. So we're neither a unit of government nor are we a nonprofit. But having said that, I've worked both within nonprofits and I've worked within local government and in federal government. And I think when you're talking about nonprofits, picking up on what Diane was talking about, I think it's really important that we remember that when the idea of nonprofits were created, The board was meant to function as representational democracy, right? The board wasn't originally intended to just be money. It was originally intended to represent the public and to ensure that the organization was doing good, was doing public good. These are publicly incorporated organizations. And if we were to sort of think about representational democracy, and we were to think about some fictional country coming to the United States and saying, we're representational democracy, and our version of representational democracy is that a rich person picked 3 of his friends and they picked their successors in perpetuity, we would laugh. But that's the form of representational democracy that many of our nonprofit boards have. So I think in terms of authorizing environment at the nonprofit level, we have to think about how are our boards actually functioning, and do they actually represent the totality of the public that they're meant to. For those of us who are working within federal or state, in the case of this call, government entities, it's been my experience that a lot more is possible than we sometimes think is possible. And that I've been amazed at the change that I've seen colleagues at every level of state government. So middle management, leadership, folks that are just beginning their career, are able to make by not just accepting when someone says, oh, that's not possible, but digging into the why of that's not possible, and is there a different way around it? So my experience has been that authorizing environments are actually far more flexible, but in order to understand that, you sort of have to have patience and fluency with bureaucracy, and you have to understand the pink forms that are still the stuff of government, and understanding how to shuffle them and redeal them.
Solid. Maurine, I'm going to ask you to then kind of, having heard Jamie, to go back to your comment about authorizing environments, and just ask you to say a little bit more, like in the context of what you aspire to do in your own work, the success that you aspire to see in your partners in the field. Where does how do you think about how one navigates an environment where you have to that's characterized by maybe permission, or that's characterized by a purse that is opened or closed by someone else?
Well, I think one of the things actually is that often we won't even ask something because we have made a decision on behalf of others. And so I think that the very first thing is to be willing to ask. I think that Jamie's point about being well-versed in the context that you're in is really, really essential. But assuming that you have adequate information and grounding, I think to make that ask can be the start of a conversation, even if you don't get an immediate yes to whatever the question is. The other thing that I think we often overlook is the importance of colleagues, both inside and outside of whatever office it is in which we're working. Often we act as if we're sort of going it alone, but in fact, and it can feel that way sometimes, I admit, but the fact is we are part of an army of folks doing a piece of work to move the needle on certain conditions and circumstances. Who is it, perhaps inside or outside your organization, who could be a helpful thought partner to you, who might have gone through something similar? So again, this notion of humbling ourselves, to be willing to ask a set of questions. How did you do this? What was your first step? What should I anticipate if I try it? So I think that our colleagues are really rich sources of information that we can easily forget about sometimes. Even if there's no immediate information forthcoming, just to have those connections to workshop ideas over time, to be directed to other resources, I think is important. So I think inside your organization, having colleagues there, the chances are if you're in certain environments, you're not the first person to think of a thing. You know, maybe someone else has thought about that before. Perhaps they're in a different area. In my organization, for example, maybe if I went to the child well-being program, there may be some things that that program has tried that the arts program is just thinking about for the first time. So going, quote unquote, across the aisle to ask my colleague in another program area that may not be arts, but from which there might be important transferable learnings to figure out how to proceed. So those are just two of the ideas that I would have in answer to your question.
You know, Maureen, thanks for that. And just, you know, thanks for that reminder that, you know, we do actually have each other, you know, and that we can be great resources to each other. And, you know, I'm partly, Kelly may give me a gold star for saying this, but this is one of the great values from my perspective of NASA is this like it's this network that has, you know, great opportunities for connectivity. You know, there've been resources that have been posted in the chat from NASA about things that relate directly to our conversation. And it just feels like a really great reminder for us all to remember that, you know, we can lean on each other. It's trickier though, it feels like, doing it in a time of social distancing where chance, you know, Diane, I believe you were talking about, Diane or Jamie, one of you, was talking about those weak connections, you know, and these moments of spontaneity and connecting with people. And so, you know, just some encouragement for us to try a little bit more. Eric, I'll invite you to participate in facilitating a Q&A. I will say that I'm seeing one question in the chat that that's about you know, helping form partnerships. I'm reading this as if you all can't see the chat yourselves, but the question, you're considering brokering partnerships between large, predominantly white-led, relatively well-funded organizations and smaller budget organizations, BIPOC-led. And I'd love to hear more about how to go about it, resources, types of facilitators, thought partners to engage. And so it'd be curious for the panel to respond to that. Maureen, one dimension of, if you respond to this, I'd be curious is the way in which you navigate offering suggestions. You kind of spoke to this earlier, ways in which you navigate offering suggestions and not having a partner hear that as you must do. And certainly, Diane, just your experience related to helping people think about when something like merger is appropriate, just the steps, the thought process. So, yeah.
Maureen, would you like to take it first?
Yeah, sure. So I think that, you know, again, back to Jamie and one of the early comments, which was about these connections. I think that the root of all of this is trust, trusted relationships. So if you have those trusted relationships with anyone, you can say certain things that you wouldn't say with folks where that does not exist, or what might be called weak connections. You might not be as forthcoming. You might not be willing to ask the provocative question. You might not be willing to really describe how the sausage is made. But when you have relationships that exist and are based on trust, you can have more forthright conversations. So in terms of brokering these partnerships, I think that hopefully you have the kind of relationship with a BIPOC-led organization to say, hey, what would you need for this partnership to be fruitful for you? What are the pitfalls? Because once again, they've probably done this before, and they probably know the outcomes that they want to avoid. So it's really important to ask those fundamental questions about what is a win and what's a challenge for an organization. So the most important resource is the relationship. And in terms of thought partners, again, I think you have to ask the organizations who they trust, who they value, who they find useful, in brokering these sorts of partnerships as well. So I think it really is about using that resource of the organization to help direct you in terms of how you can make what you do matter the absolute most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I echo those sentiments and add just the perspective of my work. We do a ton of partnership strategy across the field, and they're absolutely based in those trusted relationships that Maurine has already spoken to. Because without that trust, it feels like an empty checkbox in a way. So the first step for us is always understanding partnership to what end. If it's partnership to the end of trying to check a diversity box to say we have Black vendors, we have Black partners, anyone can see through that, and it's not going to be a long-term sustainable relationship. It's going to feel artificial. It's going to feel like lust for that organization. So for us, we try to push our clients into the direction of really reevaluating what they want to do. And sometimes the motive and incentive is to diversify, is to feel more ethically grounded in who they are as a public serving institution. But sometimes the partnership doesn't lead them to partner with this BIPOC-led organization. Sometimes it's partnering with a white-led organization that has a huge capacity in their endowment and ability to grant, and coming together in one mega partnership to then provide new pathways and funds directly to BIPOC-led organizations so that they can do their thing. So it really depends on the angle of the partnership, what you're trying to get out of it, and making sure that you're explicit about what you're benefiting from, what the partnership organization is also benefiting from, and ultimately that no one is being harmed along the way. We see a lot of ancillary harm that's done because organizations haven't quite understood where they fit in the ecosystem. And so if you're reaching out to totally new to start a relationship with a BIPOC-led organization, and you're doing it without the level of self-awareness that it's not a happy accident that most white-led organizations are well-funded and BIPOC-led organizations are not well-funded. You don't have that awareness, you have the ability to create ancillary harm that you're not even aware of. And so when we have our organizations who are really committed to diversifying their internal organizations, their vendor network, their audiences and communities, we ask them to do that thoughtfully. And we ask them to do it in a way that reassesses the power dynamics that Maurine also mentioned at the top of our meeting. So coming to that with a level of awareness and a level of humility and a level of grace to say, here's what we ultimately want to get out of this. Here's what we hope you'll get out of it. Now you tell us what you want and need, and let's see how we can help each other in sharing our audiences, sharing our spaces. That was a big thing in a pre-COVID era for organizations that are smaller to say, yes, we are the Met. We will lend our exhibition space to this organization to enable this other thing to happen because they don't have that capacity. We will give that as a show of our partnership. Look at what resources you have in your own capacity and see what you can lend, see what you can share. That does not necessarily need to be a reciprocal exchange of equal value, because the dynamics that exist between these organizations are not equal. They have very different sets of capacity, very different sets of resources. And it doesn't make that other organization unworthy of being at the table. In fact, it only increases the prominence of having that voice in your partnership network. You just have to do it in a way that is thoughtful, in a way that also takes into consideration those power dynamics that we mentioned earlier on.
And I can just tag on with 3 quick bumpers, which is one, our colleague Lila Tamari, who is on the call but had to drop off, when we were funding partnership work at ArtPlace, she and her colleagues instituted a policy where the partners, anyone who is listed as a partner, had to answer one of the application questions separately. And that question was, what do you want to get out of this partnership? And if those answers aren't all the same, that's a leading indicator that this maybe isn't a partnership. The second thing, Omari, since you put it in the mind of language, it's interesting to just note that in the question and in our responses to it, we all assumed that it was going to be large white institutions wanting to collaborate with BIPOC organizations. And if BIPOC organizations aren't wanting to collaborate with large white organizations, that maybe is a leading indicator that something's off, and we might want to approach that a little bit differently. And then just lastly, whenever I think about collaboration, I think of when George first was asked what it was like to collaborate with Stephen Sondheim. And he said, well, first he would collaborate me for a while, and then I would collaborate him. And so I think that's an important thing to remember too about collaboration.
I just wanted to tag on one additional thing here, which is that often when there are two organizations of disparate size, one much larger and one less so, we typically have a frame that the smaller organization will get more out of it than the larger one. So I think the invitation for us is to really check how we're valuing what each of the organizations is bringing to the table. I mentioned much earlier the intellectual capital and the relationships that organizations of color bring to the table. But to be frank, too often we, in the world of funding and philanthropy, think of smaller organizations as less capable. And while it's true, if you look at their balance sheet, they will not be as robust. I think it all depends on how you count. I mean, we all at this point know this time-worn quote, perhaps that Albert Einstein said, or not. It's a matter of some debate that everything that counts cannot be measured, just, to riff off of that. And so I think that we have to reframe how we're thinking about, from our perspective, as Diane said, to what end is the partnership, and to be open to additional possibilities than perhaps those that might present to us at first blush about what the value add of partnerships might be.
Thanks for that, Maurine. And I just wanted to call out, again, this is personally fascinating to me, and that is what you all continue to talk about doing, and it's challenging assumptions. Maurine, you're talking about thinking, like, challenging values and around, well, who does, who has an ability to bring more value? Is it always a large organization, a longer established? What are, Jamie, the leading indicators that would tell us X, Y, or Z? And as we think about doing our work, that approach and being able to do that yourself or with colleagues just feels like such a rich process to invest in. Eric, I could ask another question from the chat, but I'll turn it over to you for a sec if you want to kind of do your thing with Q&A.
No, go ahead, Omari. I think we're both cruising the same thing. Just leave me time for a couple questions at the end.
Great, perfect. And folks, I would say in terms of asking a question, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand, or yes, do the thing, and then we'll figure it out. One question that I also noticed in the chat was around, I'll say, the word diversity and how one helps spur more diversity in a system that feels homogeneous. How would you respond to that? That is, if somebody says, for instance, well, our city is like 95% white, so what are we supposed to do? Diane, Maurine, Jamie.
I'll return to the language question, which is that the word diversity itself is a bit of a grenade. It's vague, right? As a term, it's used in very different ways. You can have a city that is 99% white, but still have a great deal of diversity and experience and income level and educational attainment. And so to be specific, and I know it's difficult because in our country, race is the hot button issue that no one talks about more than anything else. So to boldly wade in those waters and say exactly what you want to do, if it's bringing in more ethnic, racial diversity in particular, that can even be pushed to exactly what you want to do. Maurine quoted the sometimes attributed to Einstein quote, not everything that counts can be counted or measured, and not everything that counts. Well, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. I think is the full quote. And that's true of moving the lever and quote unquote diversity. So if it's to have a mirror that reflects your national portrait, your state portrait, your regional portrait, it's up to you to define the limitations, the guide rails of what you're ultimately trying to achieve, and to be explicit about that, and to reflect on that, and to hold yourself accountable to that. But I think when we use really loose terms like diversity, inclusion, it's often not specific enough for us to actually know what we're talking about. And so you never know if you've achieved it. So when it comes to cities that might be more homogenous, I ask you to think a little bit more broadly about your geographical boundaries, because perhaps you can be telling a story of your state or of our nation more broadly. So that's just a starting place if you're thinking, how can we kind of loosen ourselves from the homogeneity of one specific region?
Comment not required, but I will open the floor, Jamie and Maureen. Thank you, Diane. That was great.
So I'll jump in with two quick things. The first is, we've had a lot of conversations in the field about cultural equity, and cultural equity is something that there have been a lot of definitions thrown around. And the one that I tend to use is one that acknowledges that I have a right to see my own story told. And I have a responsibility to see the stories of other people, right? So I have a right to see my own story, and I have a responsibility to see other stories, which means we both need to diversify the Philharmonic audience, and we need to diversify the taiko drumming audience. And I think about our colleagues at Flushing Town Hall in Queens, which is one of the most diverse places in the United States. And their goal is to present all of the cultures that are represented in Queens. And their goal is that you should not be able to look at the audience to tell what's on stage, right? So they want everyone to come to see everyone. So I think balancing that right and responsibility to see my own story and see the stories of other people is really helpful. And then an artist project that I'll just point folks to is there's a really interesting artist collective called the Ghana Think Tank. And I can go on at some length about this, but it's essentially 3 colleagues who come out of the USAID world, who found that it was problematic that the first world was always fixing the third world. And so they flip that paradigm, and they create think tanks in countries like El Salvador, Morocco, Iran, other places like that, and ask them to solve first world problems. And there's an extraordinary project they did in Westport, Connecticut. So the homework assignment I'll leave everyone with is to Google Ghana Think Tank and Westport, Connecticut, and take a look at that project as a way to maybe expand some of our thinking around this question.
So, folks, I would just, you know, as we kind of look toward closing out and wrapping up, you know, go to this question of hope. Certainly, I mean, I take tons of hope from the ideas that panelists you all expressed, and in general. So that's not to say that, and now finally let's talk about hope. But it would be nice to have just very explicit and direct conversation about that, and what is making you each very hopeful? What's making you smile and get goosebumps? You know, as you move about your day. And I'd also ask the room, you know, if we're going to kind of embrace our inner poets again, a bit of a challenge to come up with a phrase that treats hope as an acronym. So if you were going to write a phrase that embodies hope and you used hope, H-O-P-E, as an acronym, what would yours be? And you know, that's a tricky one. I believe in you all as creative folks, and all the answers are beautiful. I'm telling you that already. I'd love to see what you come up with. So yes, Maureen, Jamie, Diane, Hope, Giggly, Goosebumpy, Smiley. What does it mean for you?
Well, at first, a confession, which is I am, as my late partner would say, a prisoner of hope. So I never lose it. In fact, it's as essential as oxygen to my way of thinking. Having said that, you know, there are times that look more or less positive, and in which one wonders, well, how long will it take for meaningful shifts to occur? But I will tell you that one of the things that gives me great hope right now is that although for me, as Jamie alluded to this earlier, I feel like this is maybe round 3 of these types of discussions around multiculturalism, cultural diversity, equity, all that it feels as if there is a different kind of opening. This time it feels that it does have a bit more stickiness. And so I'm encouraged by that. But finally, you know, honestly, my daughter, who's an adult and who is one of the smartest people I know, and who is carrying the movement forward. So I know that when I go take my nap, that the world is still in good hands because of her and her colleagues who are picking up. I heard someone talk about this like a relay race not too long ago, a few days ago, and it does feel like, you know, there is a host of young people coming up behind us to whom we can pass the baton. Not only will they pick it up, but they will run faster and longer, perhaps. And so that gives me hope every day.
Solid. Thank you, Maureen. Jamie, Diane, 45 seconds probably each.
So I'll go quickly and say one of the things that gives me hope is for a long time the philanthropic sector has focused on innovation around new ideas. And increasingly I'm seeing a focus on indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, and remembering that we had many of the ways of living sustainably figured out 11,000 years ago. And that sometimes the job isn't to invent, sometimes the job is to remember. And so remembering ancestral knowledge is one of the things that gives me hope.
I love
Thank
that.
you, Jamie.
Maureen, you're in good company. I too am a very hopeful, optimistic person, and it's helped me navigate great challenges in my life. I'm most inspired by the people who aren't waiting to see how the world changes before they go out and they act, and they do. I live in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. Every time I leave my apartment to go for a run, I see artists painting murals. I see people saying, hey, there's no gym, let's go create one in the park. People are recreating the structures that they once have lost, and they're not waiting for institutions and bureaucracies to tell them that it's okay to do it. And I'm inspired by that level of just go-getter attitude that is still deeply entrenched in community and in service, and excited to see how the field, quote unquote, catches up to all of the energy that's already being put out there by the artists and the individuals and the communities themselves.
Great. Diane, thanks for that. And again, Maureen, Jamie, Diane, thank you for sharing. Thanks for kind of filling us up with some super solid bits of insights, hope, ideas, for demonstrating collegiality, and for doing the work that you do day in and day out. We all appreciate it. I benefited from it, and I'm assuming that the room has benefited from it. So again, thank you, NASA, for setting this table for us today. Super solid, and thank you all for filling the chat with those wonderful acronyms, expanded of hope. It's really beautiful. Bonus points to Sunil for, in my opinion, coming up with the best one, because of course it's appropriately used the O as Omari. So